Good afternoon, everyone. I imagine some of you were in the previous session and it ran over a few minutes, so we've had a quick turnaround here. I'm Susan Hull. I am a nurse and an informaticist, and I'm working as the Chief Health Informatics Officer with DiverseNet. So I'm really pleased to be moderating the panel today. And I've had a chance to visit with a few of you already in the hallway together, and I understand there's some great audience participation questions. So we really do want to make this a conversation, and each of our panelists are prepared to make remarks for about 5 to 7 minutes and give you a different vantage point of standards and operability in the mobile health space based on their background. Then I will pose 3 or 4 questions to the panel, and then we'd like you to be thinking about, as you get started, listening to get your questions ready, and you can proceed to the to the microphones. So it looks like we're set and ready to go, and I'm going to, just to be brief here and expeditious of our time, I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves. Aaron?
So it's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Aaron Goldmunts, and I'm representing West Health. West Health is a conglomerate of several organizations focusing on lowering the cost of healthcare. We have the West Health Institute in San Diego and West Health Policy Center here in Washington, D.C., as well as an incubator and an investment fund. What I'm going to talk about, which I think is a great way to start this panel, is about cost. Interoperability, which we'll get to in just a moment, is something that we believe is vitally important to help us really face the challenges of the healthcare cost crisis in the U.S. I'm not going to go over these numbers in detail, but you can really appreciate that we're facing some challenges. It's somewhat relevant that we're here in Washington, D.C. We're talking about a fiscal cliff, and among those topics is what we're going to do with Medicare and how we're going to fund that over the long term. So it's important that we think about technology and how technology can really be utilized for enabling lowering the cost of healthcare. I'm going to bring 3 interesting, relevant kind of publications that came out recently. The first one is the Institute of Medicine report on the best care at lower cost that just came out a couple months ago. One of their primary recommendations, and this is clearly, it's a large report and this is clearly just a snippet of it, but one of their primary recommendations was enabling the digital health infrastructure. And with that, to achieve that goal, one of the quotes from that publication was that there was needed to enable the data exchange, and interoperability is needed to support our healthcare system for the future. So the topic of interoperability is relevant and pertinent when we think about lowering the cost of healthcare, and that's also coming from the Institute of Medicine. Also, it has to do with safety. If you look at a publication that just came out a couple weeks ago from ECRI, they talked about the top 10 health technology hazards. And number 5 on that list was interoperability failures with medical devices and health IT systems. Interestingly, number 1 and number 2 also are relevant to interoperability. Number 1 being, let's see if I can remember them in order. Number 1 had to do with, it's in the memory banks there somewhere. Number 1 had to do with, number 2 had to do with, I'll come back to 1. Number 2 had to do with infusion pump medications, and number 1 had to do with alarms. Both of those can be solved through medical device interoperability. See, I got back to it. Okay, and then the next thing I want to touch base on is just at the beginning of last month, there was a summit sponsored by Amy and the FDA. It was a summit on interoperability. It was here in Washington, D.C., and the press release that came out of the first day of that summit was misaligned incentives and lack of standardization are just some of the barriers to achieving interoperability. So again, I'm just bringing some relevant topics around the topic of interoperability. I like to do just a quick transition with a little bit of humor in terms of plug and play and medical device interoperability. I actually came from the implanted medical device space, and so this is somewhat relevant to me, but it also shows how quickly the industry is evolving around digital media and other communications, yet we're still fairly far behind from a plug-and-play standpoint for medical devices. And so can we achieve plug-and-play from a medical device standpoint? And my argument is that you can. Our primary disruptive drivers when we think about interoperability is that standards are important. I can't emphasize that enough. You're going to hear Chuck talk about that a little bit later. We believe that standards exist today that can be achieved and can be appropriate for health and mobile health technologies, yet they're not being adopted at a significant rate. So how can we change that? The other challenge is, and I've come from the medical device industry, and it's very easy to create something that works and works effectively, but not thinking about how that will interact with other devices. And so there's a lot of silos, a lot of data silos, a lot of technology silos. So I think breaking those barriers, and what we've also found is that those silos are really costing healthcare delivery challenges because they're the ones that have to interface and create connections and try to build bridges between those device technologies. The third one is really as we look at innovation in the future. Think how easy it is to create a mobile app today, but when you get into the healthcare domain, that becomes very challenging. So once you get to a standard way of achieving that, it can actually spur a lot of innovation and a lot of creativity. And we need to get to a place where we can exchange data that can really spark innovation and drive the industry forward. And finally, it's all about patient care. It's about getting the right data at the right time, the right place when it's needed. That's what mobile health is about. That's what healthcare delivery of the future is about, and that's what we are very excited about. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but we at West Health are looking at how you can take standards and standard implementation guidelines and really create the adoption of those more efficiently. So how can you get standards through an embedded software approach into the development ecosystem to make it really easy to adopt medical device standards? Think of your TCP/IP protocol for internet, how that's all the way embedded in a chipset, it's available, so a developer doesn't even have to think twice about that. That's where we think the industry needs to go. Finally, I'll just end on this. It's my stool slide. It's a balanced approach. We need to take a balanced approach when we're thinking about enabling medical device interoperability. So it's the standards. You need to make sure it's easy to adopt those standards, and those standards need to exist. It's healthcare delivery, and this is where they have the most to benefit, but they don't have the voice or haven't delivered the voice that they need to in terms of what needs to happen and to drive the adoption of medical device interoperability. And finally, it's policy and regulatory sides. You need to make sure that there's a clear pathway and the appropriate incentives to enable device interoperability to happen. I'll pause there, turn it over to my co-panelists, and look forward to the Q&A.
Let's see if we go forward. We need the slides for Chuck Parker, Continua Health Alliance, next.
So while they're getting those loaded up, I'm Chuck Parker. I'm the Executive Director of the Continua Health Alliance. And Continua in and of itself is an organization that has been around for about 6.5 years. We focus on the interoperability standards for what we call personal care devices. And these are devices that you typically would find outside the four walls of traditional healthcare space. These are devices that you would take home, use in the home environment, such as weight scales, glucometers, blood pressure cuffs, pulse oximetry machines, such these types of devices. It makes it relatively straightforward for us to use these, and what we want to do is make sure that we're using them in an effective way across the board. So Continua was founded by 22 member organizations back in 2006. We now have more than 200 organizations that are focusing on how to come together as an industry to move the approach forward so that we can now create a set of standards that interconnect these devices. Continua itself is not a standards body. What we are is a guidelines organization. We work with other standards bodies out in the organizational activities of healthcare, such as IEEE, such as HL7. We also incorporate additional features such as those from the cellular industry. We also incorporate those from the standard internet for security purposes, using things such as SAML tokens for security in this case. But what Continua does create is a set of guidelines that define very clearly how you integrate these standards and how you put them together. Okay, still no slides. I can keep talking here, it's not a problem. But from my perspective, we take a look at how we actually integrate those together to create a total solution in this case. So what we're after here in this market space is moving towards a complete ecosystem, and that ecosystem means devices that can communicate with one another, but ultimately when you have the set of guidelines, what you need to have is a certification that these devices have now met that interoperability requirement. So one thing that we do achieve then at the end of this is a
Tell them to go up one. Yep. Nope.
sorry about this. So what we do is we actually certify these devices through independent test labs across the globe. So Continua is now working with 7 independent test labs throughout the globe to certify that these devices have now been implemented and are now effectively available in the market space. So we now have had 80 different devices that have now been certified in this case, and we have more than 100 that are now in the pipeline to continue moving forward with in the industry in this case. So Continua itself is a set of guidelines, as I mentioned. What happens with the guidelines is that it does incorporate standards-based approaches, but what we do is we actually constrain down what the standards actually do in this case. So we very clearly define not only what an IEEE standard is, but at the very basic level we say if there's an A or B option, you have to define and using only A or B in that case. And so it's important that we have industry together to figure out what those decisions need to be. A lot of cases, and in several, eventually over time, what you end up is that some technologies don't get chosen and don't get selected. This is the case for us when we were as Continua going through the decision process several years ago, particularly for low power radios, and came to the conclusion that Bluetooth Low Energy and Zigbee were the best ways for us to approach that industry, which means that there were 5 other radios that didn't make that selection process. So unfortunately, this process, while it is consensus-led, does lead you eventually down to the pathway of only standardizing on a few things. But ultimately for consumers, that's a good thing, because what you do is you bring economies of scale. You bring the ability to ensure that that device is going to communicate with the next device it's plugging into. So I don't have to worry about, does this radio, is it a blue radio, is it a red radio, is it an orange radio? I know that I can now integrate these devices together and ensure that they're going to communicate. And as I said, this is industry that's doing this. We're not being forced by governments to do this. We're taking this approach from an industrial perspective and coming together as a whole to solve these solutions ahead of, and in some cases, the desire and need for the industry itself. We've been very deliberate in approaching this on an international basis, and that's very intentional from that perspective, because we don't want to go back and have to create country-by-country specific solutions. So we didn't want our member companies to have to worry about making sure that, okay, I have a German version versus a UK version versus a US version. We've been very pragmatic in taking the approach of understanding what are the regulatory requirements, what are the policy requirements for countries, and ensuring that we now have implemented those technologies that are appropriate, but inclusive, so that we now can create one set of device standards for the entire globe as opposed to country by country in this case. That allows us to create economies of scale relatively rapidly. And it also allows us to be able to move into devices that can cross borders and effectively make sure that they can still communicate in this case. So I think those are important steps for us in how we approach this. Continua itself has currently worked with 12 different device classes. We now have more than 13 different standards that are now integrated into the overall Continua guidelines. We're about to release our 5th set of guidelines internally, and we now make these publicly available now. So it's not something that you have to be a member to participate in from that standards-based approach. What we're seeing here, though, is that this activity is integrating and now taking off. We've now seen the nation of Denmark now use the Continua framework as its basis for how it will be rolling out its mHealth standards in the future as well. And we expect to hear a couple of other countries by year end make that same announcement. So with that said, I think that's a little bit more about standards. And sorry I didn't get to show you my slide deck here, but we'll certainly, hopefully you got at least the gist of the information I was able to communicate with you on this. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chuck, and I do trust that all the slides are going to be available for participants, so we'll get that corrected. Why don't you pull up the next slide deck in the back, and we'll go with whoever you pull up. That way we won't have a mismatch here. You know, these are the first day jitters. Okay, that worked out perfect. Deborah Estrin, thank you.
Sure. Hello, I'm Deborah Estrin. I'm co-founder with Ida Sim of Open mHealth. We have a booth. Come visit us. And I'm also a professor of computer science at the new Cornell Tech campus in Manhattan. So thanks to the efforts we just heard about, there is increasing interoperability down at the medical device level. And as you see a lot of on the exhibition floor and around the conference, mobile health is about those devices, as well as apps running on your phone and apps running in the background on your phone, or apps interacting with you, and a lot of things going on in the cloud behind all those apps and devices. And so interoperability is critical to get those devices speaking, but interoperability continues to be critical as you move up the stack, if you will, in order to have individuals really be able to readily use the best tools and the best apps for them. No one system, no one vendor is going to deliver the one monolithic mobile experience that's going to work from diabetes to depression and across all demographics. What people expect from their mobile device is the ability to personalize it and go with their preferences. And really, Open mHealth is trying to promote an open ecosystem in which we allow for that kind of patient-centric specification and configuration, at the same time doing in a way that is really clinician-informed. So that balance between being both patient-centric and clinician-informed. And so that every person, with the uniqueness of her life and her dynamic conditions and her different needs and capabilities and preferences, can pull apps and opportunities and devices together. In order to do that, we need things to be modular so that you can fit them together. And in order to have modularity be useful, you have to have interoperability. There's no point in modularity without interoperability between those modules. And so that interoperability-enabled modularity we see as essential really to make the ecosystem innovative. If you want the ecosystem to be innovative, be able to build off of the interesting innovations coming from human interaction design to new types of devices to new kinds of decision support off of those data streams, you want to be able to pull the best techniques together at any point in time. So interoperability is really critical at this current phase of mobile health, where both the technology but also the practice, the methodology around using mobile health is evolving, and it's evolving through these three cycles of the patient doing self-care, the clinician seeing new types of data and helping that inform their clinical care, and the data coming off of these to really produce new kind of evidence about how people take care of themselves in everyday, during the course of their everyday life and outside of clinical settings. Mobile health is the first context that's really recording that data and making it digital and available as evidence. So Open mHealth is following in the good history of TCP/IP and the Internet and Continua and West in defining open APIs and interoperability standards to allow a lot of iterative development of new approaches. What you saw in the context of the Internet evolving and everything we know and love from the web to social media is that these interoperability standards developed in the context of people building, running systems and running code. The tagline of the IETF was rough consensus and running code to define new standards, and they were emerged and they developed through active use. So we promote the embedding of a lot of detailed analytics in the use of these applications, because in that sense you really can drive a continuous kind of evaluation of your methodology, of your care, and of the apps themselves. So to get a little bit more concrete and hopefully not scare you away, we have defined an architecture that's already represented by code sitting in an open source repository. Our code is the glue that helps to connect between both proprietary and open source components. And we think of things broken down into really the data storage units, which is the capture and the storage of data, the data processing that helps to make sense of that data, the data visualization that presents that data. And there's a lot of modular innovation going on and a lot that can be shared across the range of applications, again, from depression to diabetes. And what's important is that as somebody comes up with a new innovation, that can be used and embedded inside of your new application, and you don't have to go and reinvent that component that already exists. So the open APIs that we defined allow you very simply to get data, read data from data storage units. It allows DPUs to pass data through a pipeline of processing and allows data visualization to pull in processing that runs over data that's in the data storage unit. And if you come to see our booth, you will see two use cases demonstrated. One is in the context of PTSD, where we've pulled together a half a dozen partners, existing applications, and existing tools that come together in the support of an individual who's using PTSD Coach from the VA to manage their PTSD, along with a mood monitoring application with a very innovative way of inputting mood data, mood map from Margie Morris from Intel, along with a meds monitoring application where the data gets stored in Health Vault, and through the definition of very light-handed, easy to define payload IDs that let you instantiate these new APIs between applications, it's quite easy, if you will, to pull these things together into a coherent end-to-end application. No one entity designed all the mobile apps. No one entity designed the clinical interface. And yet for this particular individual, they wanted to pull together these sets of apps and share certain data with their clinician. Our second scenario is around type 1 diabetes. Here we have devices as well. Obviously, these are devices already existing, making use of other existing standards to get their data up into the cloud. And we, again, through the use of open APIs defined in the simple open mHealth architecture, allow that device data to be combined with yet another innovative way of capturing affect and mood, as well as exercise and day-to-day physical activity as another input into diabetes management, and having that come back to both the patient and their clinician with a collaboration with Green Dot, very innovative startup in the type 1 diabetes management space. Obviously, we didn't write all the software. We wrote very little of it, just the glue, and then with published standards to allow these things to interoperate and to serve as a model how things can interoperate far more broadly. So just to summarize, we're pursuing an architecture with very lightweight, sometimes has a negative connotation, so light-handed ways of standardizing the interfaces between software and between software components and data. We publish reference implementations and we publish the APIs, and we welcome you to come by our booth 216 to hear more.
Thank you, Deborah. We're letting the group in the back drive. Do, 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 do. Who's going to be next? You all have another presenter up? No, Prevendus is not in our group. That's a wrong slide deck. A lack of interoperability, yeah. Okay, Eric.
Thank you, everybody. I actually prepared about 40 slides for about 5 minutes, so don't think that's going to work. But what I actually wanted to do, first of all, is just introduce myself. My name is Eric Pupo. I'm a senior manager at Deloitte, and I actually work in interoperability. That's my life. That's all I do. Standards. If you can think about how much fun that is, it can be very challenging sometimes to deal with. Some of my colleagues that I work with are here, and I've actually worked in standards interoperability now for about 10 years. I work at the Office of National Coordinator on a lot of their standards interoperability efforts. So if you think back to the days of HITSP and other interoperability initiatives, and then also now working on the integrated electronic health record between DoD and VA. And in all cases, what I've found is interoperability has its own inherent set of challenges, and you really don't see a big shift in the terms of challenges between what we would call the standard ground-based interoperability challenges versus the mobile challenges. What you do see this time, though, is there are a tremendous amount of lessons learned from interoperability efforts that have gone on over the last 8 to 10 years, where the standards development organizations, the vendors, all those who are involved in interoperability, who have learned these lessons the hard way, I think, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, are now applying that to mobile to really accelerate and quicken the pace of standards development so that interoperability challenges in mobile don't cause as many issues. Really, what I wanted to cover mostly was point 2, which was really mobile health standards. I think all of you have a pretty good background on what some of the challenges and issues are related to mobile health. Really, number 2 is important because really the last 5, 10 years with standards development that's gone on now and as part of meaningful use, interoperability is getting there. And it's really now more a matter of trial and error, piloting, actions. And you see a lot of that at conferences you go to in health IT where that's actually occurring. When we talk about mobile health, we're now taking a lot of those standards that were developed for health information exchanges, for electronic health records, for PHRs, and actually making them mobile. So I want to talk a little bit about what that is involving. And then also talk a little bit about social media and patient engagement, because that's where mobile is a little different. Use an example, I told a colleague, when you spoke 7, 8 years ago about standards, if people didn't like your speech, they'd just fall asleep, or they'd leave. Now they tweet bad stuff about you. And they can go out and put you on Facebook and talk bad about you and everything. And they can do it right here. And I see like 20 of you doing that right now. That's the kind of stuff that's different about mobile standards and patient engagement is there's a lot of information flowing now that's out there. Versus previous interoperability efforts, you could have a little more control over that information about what was actually being passed around. So, sorry if I skip a few of the slides. These will all be available, as Susan mentioned. One of the things that really struck me about mobile health is the level of patient engagements that is possible with the patient. So really it comes down, when you're talking about interoperability, how engaged can we make the patient in their care? You're sending them information securely. You're encouraging them to improve their health. What you're also doing is you're making that information available to them, and you need to make them feel like it's safe and secure. So really, Stage 2 meaningful use was kind of a kickoff point for that. And as that work evolves, you'll start to see, I think, some of the patient engagement goals improve as mobile health interoperability improves. But I think what's also important is with patient information being portable, especially on devices like an iPhone and an iPad, you're going to have a lot of the same challenges. How do you aggregate information that's on the move about a patient? Same problem we have with health information exchanges. How can you engage patients in their care with a complete picture? Right now, it's a lot of providers. The providers gather all this information together from summary documents. They put it together. They speak to a patient. Well, in mobile, it's a little different. Now, actually, what you're doing is you're asking the patient, in terms of their level of information, to aggregate. And a lot of that comes from these mobile health apps that you see out on the exhibit show floor. A lot of this is now being developed. In order to do that, the patient, and now, in terms of the standards that are being developed, now needs to be actively more engaged. So the 3 standards are really going to focus on. One is consolidated CDA. The CDA standard, which is really a basis for a lot of the care summary records we see now, It's part of meaningful use. It has rapidly been adopted by many organizations to really represent the patient care summary, patient data. But we also have standards now one is called Mobile Health Access for Documents. And this is really leveraging existing health information exchange standards from IHE, where they've decided, let's actually make information freely available on medical devices, on mobile devices, that you would make available normally through a health information exchange, make that available to patients. And the inherent challenges in doing that, some of the security, privacy challenges that you would encounter. And then the last one I'll talk about is something a few of you might be familiar with the Direct project. And we talk about the Direct project, it's very much designed for point-to-point, quick information exchange. And this actually fits very well in a mobile health world. Because if we're talking about just secure emails to patients, if we're talking about secure exchange of information that's very quick, that's the type of protocol we use. Now, talk a little bit about CCDA in terms of where it fits in the larger picture. And the way it fits is, this is just an explanation of what it is. And as it's evolved, you're now moving to things like HTML5. So how can I make a CDA document? If any of you have ever looked at one, that in itself is a challenge. But CCDA, in terms of its formatting, can be challenging for anybody to decipher and read. We don't want that for patients. What we would want more is something that's more focused on making it web-friendly. So it looks like Facebook. It looks like Twitter. It looks like something, an interface that people are very familiar with. And then the same things with the move to CDA is also a concept called microdata, where you make information available in tiny bite-sized chunks of metadata. So really what that means is you really simplify the development of the information. CDA documents, patient care summaries can be hundreds of pages sometimes. How can we simplify that so that we can represent that to a patient in mobile health on a device in a very small format? Another one is green CDA, so taking things that are very hard to understand. If any of you have worked with HL7 standards, the RIM is an example. That can be a little challenging at times. You have to learn it. And it's a way to take those standards and really simplify them. In terms of simplification, you still need to understand the context of what you're reading and looking at, but really you're focusing more now on being able to actually simplify that information to the patient by putting it more in a narrative explanatory format. Let's talk about Direct, being able to securely send information to patients. That standard has now really evolved to the point in terms of piloting where it's ready for use in a mobile health world. And now it's really a matter of getting the applications out there that can really leverage and use this standard. And an example I want to use when we talk about patient engagement is an example from an ONC project with privacy segmentation. So basically being able to actually segment information using existing standards and be able to send that mobily to a provider's device is an example of a use case where you really can use existing standards and interoperability to now make that information available mobily. And what that means is patients can now set their preferences and we can make that available mobily so that the patient doesn't have to always log in to provide consent. They can actually start to do that even through a mobile phone. That's an example of taking standards that have been developed over time for the common health information exchange environments and really applying them in a mobile world. And then one other one we talk about with mobile health access to documents and why that's so important is because you're living now in a world increasingly where vendors are working together to facilitate and empower health information exchange. So this is really a way to enable that empowerment by just using existing IHE standards that are already in place for health information exchange and making them available in a mobile world where I can now access documents that are stored in some health information exchange repository through a mobile device. All right. In the interest of time, yeah, no problem. I've made these slides available as well, so certainly. No, we'll just take questions. I think questions will be. Thanks.
If you could pull up Dennis Seymour's slide. Thank you.
So in the interest of saving time again, my name is Dennis Seymour, and I'm the Chief Security Architect for Illumin. For those of you who have never heard of us, we're a rather small company. We manage a small health information exchange between an organization called the Department of Veterans Affairs and Department of Defense, otherwise known as the Federal Health Information Exchange. Actually been working on that project since it used to be called Government Computer Patient Record, GCPR. But my primary reason for being here today is not in my role of employment, but actually I'm the chair of the Privacy and Security Committee for HIMSS. And primarily the message I'm trying to deliver today is about medical device security. For those who aren't aware, around 2003, the VA began working with HIMSS, with ACCE and a few other organizations, ECRI, for example, in the development of the medical device or manufacturer's disclosure statement for medical device security, the MDS-2. It was primarily based for U.S. HIPAA compliance, and the point was to report risks associated with medical devices. In 2008, the document was rewritten with the HIMSS committee and ACCE membership, and we developed a version based more on the high-tech requirements. And currently, the group, the HIMSS Privacy and Security Work Group, is working with ACCE and NEMA-MEDA to rewrite the MDS-2 based on IEC 80001 requirements. So basically what we've done is we've taken the new form, which should be out. It's going to go out to NEMA-MEDA voting for membership probably in the month of December, early January at the latest. And it's going to be primarily mapping the requirements of the IEC 80001. And essentially what it allows is the manufacturers of medical devices to report their compliance with specific aspects of IEC 80001. Now, in the meantime, we're still leaving the old questions in, maybe making them work in different areas. So as an example, if there's a HIPAA requirement that maps closely to an IEC 80001 requirement, it remains intact. But basically, we've gone from a one-page, 1.5-page form at the outset to a 3-page form, and now we're probably only about 4.5 pages long. So it's not like we're adding an increased large number of pages, but we are increasing the subject areas that are being addressed. So this is a little bit of the history. In the effort of time, I'll kind of flip through these. I will tell you that it's taken about 18, 19 months for us to take this form and make it work for IEC 80001. So it's no small feat to do these changes. So primarily what we've tried to do in the new form is reference support requirements. And really the goal here is in my mind, is threefold. Number one is it allows the manufacturer to report how they feel that they comply with 80001, HIPAA, high-tech, and other standards. But really, we think it belongs in the organization for two things, not from the vendor side, but from the organization side that use these medical devices. You either A, use them for the medical devices you already have in place to do a valid risk assessment. And as many of you know, when it comes to IT security, one of the findings has been in the past is that most organizations, especially smaller organizations, don't have a firm, documented process for risk management. They do it in healthcare, don't get me wrong, not dealing with risk of the patient, but dealing with the risk of the IT systems. There's not a good foundation there in a lot of organizations. So you can use it for your risk assessment. You take all your risk assessment documents, your MDS-2s, and you put them together, and you can get a valid idea of where our risks are associated with medical devices. Now the second one, or the second one for the organization, third one in total, is for pre-qualification when you're trying to buy medical devices. Let's say you have 5 products, all perform exactly the same, do pretty much the same thing, but you have concerns about what risks might this medical device introduce to my networks when I connect it. This is where these documents may come into play. A lot of organizations, one I used to work for, the VA, uses these forms as a way to go through the pre-screening and look for what are the devices, risks associated with bringing them to our networks. So we think that the form is valid for any of those uses. I think if you'll go out on the internet, do a search on Google of MDS2, you'll probably find that there's, last count I had was over 12,000 medical devices that have individual MDS2s completed on them by different vendors around the world. So it's a pretty standard form now for a lot of medical device vendors to use. I'm not going to go into great detail. We'll get through some questions here. Trying to think if there was anything else. These are the areas. A lot of people said, well, how do you mean you're using 80,001? What we've done is we've taken those, if you compare it to the NIST, the families of control areas where we've added these different areas: malware protection, person authentication, physical locks, security guards, cybersecurity updates. So each of these areas has at least one question. Some of them have as many as 15 or 16 questions. And a lot of them are the if A, then B. In other words, if you answered yes to the first one, you may have 3 or 4 more questions to answer. And certainly if the answer is no to a specific question, then maybe you don't have more questions to answer. So the form is very well laid out, very in-depth instructions. And what we tried to do this time was to minimize the amount of verbiage that we use in the questions and maximize the amount of verbiage used in the instructions. So if you're not quite sure what the question's asking on the form itself, go to the instructions form and it will tell you exactly what information we're trying to get out of the individual vendors. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis. Okay, great. So now's the time for all of you to jump in. I'm going to actually ask the panelists to get the microphones on, and we've got 2 to share. And I'm going to pose one question, and that's all, given our time. And I would like you to think about your questions and get ready at the microphone. But I think one of the reasons many of us are here at this meeting is we're excited about the potential for mobile health to change the way we think about health and care, where care is delivered. You know, as Mark Bertolini said this morning, 95% of health happens at home, in our neighborhoods, in our workplace. So what is the standards and interoperability? This is my question. What can the standards and interoperability community do to help create new paradigms for care, but significantly lower cost of care? And so thinking about, you've each kind of presented from different vantage points, what's your next mile to really contribute to continuing to evolve the paradigm of care and lower cost? Anyone?
Go ahead, please.
Not to be overly redundant with what I said before, but the more as a community that we can make modular our innovations, so that things that we developed can be used and reused, and we don't spend precious resources reinventing the wheel or components of the wheel, the more vibrant will be the ecosystem and the better it will fit individual patients with their particular conditions and in their particular demographics. So it's time to move on from a more monolithic siloed system into one that's more modular, and to do that by defining the right kind of lightweight interoperability among those systems. And again, it's in an environment that's going to be a combination of open source and proprietary, because you need those proprietary elements to drive a healthy commercial system as well.
Okay.
Yep. I would say that what we're helping here to do is achieve scale, and that's in 2 factors. It's scale from the perspective of, you know, being able to do implementations beyond just a simple demonstration, being able to, you know, no single company can implement the amount of devices that are going to be needed in the healthcare industry today. So you need scale. And I think that on the other side of that, the other scale is that you bring to it a market that is not on just a single country specific. So as I talked about earlier, you know, we're doing this intentionally to make sure that we can bring in and have devices anywhere in the world. I think that's important because you enable another level of scale that you just simply can't have for some of these device architectures.
Thank you.
So obviously we believe in, largely in the ability to drive towards an ecosystem where there's lower costs, and wholeheartedly believe that you need the right data at the right time to make the right clinical decision. And so that's the, enabling that integration of data, especially coming from devices into the care process is very important. I couldn't agree more with the comment about scale. I think that's important. I think the other element, which is a challenge, is just the fact that your point about the market drivers. Unfortunately, there's a disconnect in terms of it's somewhat of a market failure. I think device companies are still incentivized to be closed and be proprietary, and I think that both device companies and healthcare delivery need to recognize the benefits of enabling those things that they don't need to compete on, and to come to some realization about common shared infrastructure, especially around standard-based approaches for interaction, which would really enable innovation, enabling lowering costs across the entire ecosystem.
And likewise on the security side, one of the things that the vendors have found is, they always get questions on compliance, regulatory issues, and so forth. But what we try to do with the MDS2 was make it an 80-20 form. If we can give you 80% of the information that you need, you're probably still going to have to call the vendor about certain specific topics. The other thing is a lot of the vendors actually come up with 2 versions of the form. They have the pre-sale version. In other words, you don't own the property yet. It's information you should probably know to make a selection. And then they have a proprietary version, in other words, one that may disclose information and includes product documents that you get when you purchase the product. And a lot of the vendors are doing that now, where they'll say, once you buy the product, we're going to give you a lot more information. We're only giving you the information you need, so there's an 80-20. When you look at that from a perspective of scalability, it's saving the vendors money, because they're not going to have to hire 15 people who only sit and answer sales questions about a product. If 80% of the questions about security of their product is already answered on a document, you call them, the first thing they're going to do is email you the document or tell you where to find it on the web. So again, saving money down the line.
I was just going to add, in terms of more of a personal note, more in terms of contribution through your ideas, your innovations, your time, your efforts. Just like with interoperability that's occurred over the last 10 years and all the efforts that have been involved, it's really a pretty small, close-knit group of people that have worked on that. And mobile health has some great ideas. Just going out on that exhibit floor and seeing all the different applications that are out there, it's fascinating. And if we could apply some of that energy to what we might call like the plumbing work, the standards interoperability, I think that would really help to advance a lot of these standards even quicker.
Thank you. Keith? Please, people introduce yourself and then your question.
There we go. Keith Boone with GE Healthcare. I'm a standards geek, so I represent GE to a number of different standards organizations. My question is for Deborah. So, Deborah, would you consider Open mHealth to be a standards organization? And if not, are you working with standards organizations in the development of the APIs? And if so, can you describe a little bit about your relationship with some other standards organizations that have already done a lot of development in the standard space?
So you gave me an or, and I'll give the nerdy answer of a yes. And so to back up, yes. So we are a standards organization, maybe more in the flavor of the IETF, where it's about a community of folks defining standards and implementing them in reference implementation. So we really are, we've posted standardized ways of defining new APIs and data payloads, but we are not redefining standards where they already exist. So if you come and look at our use cases, we have in one of them, enteroglucometer and an A&D weight scale communicating through TUNET that's already traveling through a lot of interoperability standards to get up to their cloud, right? And we have defined some new, very lightweight standards to bring those data streams and integrate them with mobile app data streams where new ones need to be defined. So I'm not trying to waffle, but we're not reinventing standards where they exist. We're creating a context and a standards entity, if you will, So can we have a conversation? We don't have yet a formal relationship with them. We are largely through creating of new end-to-end systems and instantiating those. So very much looking forward to more of that. There isn't really a standards organization in this piece of the space because it's it's complementary to the EHR and HIE and health exchanges, and it's complementary to the device level standards. So we came about to fill a gap that sort of, if you will, fits in between those two. Does that? Okay.
Thank you. We've got someone at the microphone, and then for your hand up, you can be next. Go ahead.
Okay. Sumant, really long last name, so I'm not going to say it. I work for Cable Labs, a nonprofit R&D and patients body, but I'm also an active participant in the IETF, and I lead one of the working groups there. So since there were references to the IETF, I was wondering, well, if you look at one of the biggest advantages of the IETF, it is that it allows technologists, individuals, not necessarily companies, to come together and propose or propose a problem or an architecture or something and why it's important. And then the group decides collectively through various discussions and debates as to what needs to be solved and is it really important. And that's where the rough consensus comes in, right? If there's rough consensus that we need to solve the problem, we go about, work together, provide a solution, and then there is the concept of running code, which is people go and try to make it work. As an outsider, it's good to see that the mHealth space is really trying to tackle interoperability. But if I have a problem proposal, where do I start? Okay.
We're very much trying to follow, not reinvent that wheel, but in terms of process, follow that successful model of what happened in the context of the IETF.
Okay, one follow-up then. The good thing with IETF, when I take a proposal there, is that while it looks like it doesn't have structure, it does in the sense it provides an ecosystem of experts and also an overarching architecture body who can look at the technical security merits or the operational merits, not just compliance, right? That it's not even considered. Do you provide that? Do you provide that overarching set of guidelines and a set of experts who can make sure that everything that comes out really provides all the features you would need from a technical standpoint?
I won't monopolize, but I'll give one more answer. So at the risk of just explaining how long I have been around, so I was on one of the original instantiations of the IAB, of the IETF. And believe me, all of that structure wasn't there from the first day. Right? It emerged in the same kind of iterative, driven by use case, and it had to invent it because there wasn't really anything like the IETF before it existed. We are in that culture. We're opening up the call for new types of working groups and proposals, and we'll have a kind of, but it's all just starting to emerge in terms of our process. So we will have a small core and people who come and join that, and represented by the leads of the working groups as those begin to emerge. Right now it's just data standards, security and privacy, and overall architecture, and one on embedded evaluation that are ones that have been suggested and starting to get instantiated so far. But we're very interested in the community coming in, proposing more, and proceeding.
Okay.
I'd just like to make one other comment based on that. First of all, Cable Labs, where you come from, I think is actually a very interesting model in terms of bringing together standards development community and vendors in a very unique way, something that the healthcare industry could benefit from. I think it's what Cable has done over the last 30 years with Cable Labs guidance, I think is very intuitive and has been very structured. And there are a lot of interesting places where you can go in healthcare today, but not very well coordinated. There are a lot of efforts around mobile health, and there's the effort that you just described. IHE has some, but nothing that does it in a consolidated effort in the way Cable Labs does.
Okay. You had a question. Thank you.
John Barras, University of Maryland. I have two questions which I don't know if they have been addressed, okay? So they refer to interoperability by a different level. So I'm very familiar with the ITF and communications standards, but there the problem is a lot simpler. So here's the first question. When you integrate things like you're talking about modular systems and so on and so forth, it's not just data interoperability, right? It's also semantic interoperability, because many of these things reason and do other things. So where and how is this addressed? Question number one. Question number two, and this is for you, Dennis, for security. The biggest problem in security right now, and not just in mHealth, but in anything mobile, is what's called composable security. I have various pieces that I have certified one way or the other that they are secure. I put them together. We have theorems that they tell you that unless you do something special, the overall system is insecure. And this has been proven by hackers attacking through interfaces for various reasons. So these are interrelated questions, and they both have to do with higher level interoperability, where there are concepts and rules and reasons, and not just data interoperability. So that's for anybody.
Okay. Let's start first then with the semantic interoperability.
So we at Continue are pretty much so driven towards that activity as well, not only semantic but also syntactic interoperability as well, with using SNOMED codes, using the HL7 language structures to ensure that we can capture the data not only about what the information is, but the metadata about it as well. And in addition to that, we also apply the context in which it was accomplished. That always continues to be enhanced, though. So what you have to have in your standards-based mechanism is a feedback loop that allows you to continue to enhance that and continue to grow that. And so that's one of the things that we have on an annualized basis is a new set of releases that we can incorporate these new features as they become available, as we understand, and new ways to standardize them and be able to incorporate them into the overall aspect. And then on top of that, I think that we address that all with a strong level of security as well. So we've been very careful in deciphering what is not only the HIPAA standards in the U.S., but also the EU directives, which are three that really pertain to how you handle data, not only the medical data and identify it, but it's also what you do with the data when it's in motion and when it's at rest. And so it's ensuring that you encrypt that data. Ultimately, can anything be hacked? Yes, that's a fact. But we have to assess that risk of where what is the value of the data to the individual, and what is it going to be from the perspective of how secure do we want to make it? You can make it such that it's unusable, but also uncrackable. Right. And so we define that very...
Can you rephrase his question? I don't think everyone could quite hear it, or his comment.
Yeah, so I think, the rephrasing of the question from what I understand here is that, it's not, we don't want to make something unbreakable. You want to make an environment where you can actually exchange data in a secure fashion and make sure that we can cover that. We as Continue have here again gone through that and look at how do we define that end-to-end capability and ensure that within that context of where our ecosystem is, that we can work and provide the level of security needed to meet those requirements of the countries that have dictated what security you need to implement. So I think that, yes, we can do that. It is always at the endpoints where you have to hand off data that you have risks, and where you have, you have to ensure that you're now talking the appropriate languages with the other endpoints. So I think that still remains a challenge, and it's going to continue to remain a challenge for a period of time until we have clearly defined international standards on security.
Dennis?
Let me start by saying that the goal of the MDS2 is to address device by device from each manufacturer. That being said, of course, you have the regulatory compliance coming out of the FDA in the United States about MDDS, medical device data systems, and I think that we're kind of in a growth area right now when it comes to security, because it's kind of like the presentation earlier in one of the rooms about banking. How many of us do online banking? How much of us? Well, it's the same thing on the medical device. If you have 3 medical devices that happen to be home-based healthcare type products, and you take and each one of them transmits to a different vendor, and if there's some way pretty easy way for me to catch your telephone communications from your house or cable connection from your house and catch the transmission. When I accumulate the data, I may have information on you that normally wouldn't be there. I think it's the same issue. I totally agree with you. I think the goal right now in the MDS2 is to address one device, one vendor type of product. But we do, in the form, we do talk about the fact that when the data is then cumulative somewhere else, whether it's an MDDS or whether it's between you and the IEHR, whatever the case might be, we do talk about the fact that you need to talk about that as a risk, because certainly it's a big issue. You know, if I know that you were born in this year, I don't need to know how old you are. I can pretty guess within 1 or 2 years, right? You know, if you were born in 1956, you're either one age or you're another age. So I agree with you that if you take the data in pieces and you put it together, you have more data than you originally did. But it's not something that we're necessarily addressing now. But I do agree that from a security perspective, I mean, I've been doing this work for 17 years at the federal sector, so I'm in your court there. I'd love to be able to find a way for us to address it all at once. I'm sure the standards folks are same boat.
Okay.
Sorry, Raphael Richards. I'm at Johns Hopkins. I'm a member of the HL7 Standards Committee, at least for my specialty. I'm a member of W3C Standards Committee, Healthcare and Life Sciences. So I have a little balanced perspective on the old standards and the new. And my question to the panel here is, we have seen now with the latest release of Meaningful Use Stage 2 that EHRs are no longer required to actually exchange information with each other. So I think we've seen the very top-down heavyweight frameworks of NHIN, the less heavyweight frameworks of HIEs, and now EHRs themselves don't actually have the requirement to talk to each other. I think it is now on our shoulders, perhaps, at the mobile level, to be the vanguard of interoperability and using modern web standards to do so. My question to all of you is, are we doing this? Are we thinking about this? And are we using modern semantic web and linked data principles to actually have true semantic data atomic interoperability that is federated, requires no toll gatekeeper that needs to be an honest broker to do the interoperability that is actually semantic and not syntactic, which is these older standards that everyone is using to now?
Thank you.
Yes.
You want to elaborate?
Yes, please elaborate.
And yes, we're doing it as well with the continuous. So we are using some of the you know, for example, we work very closely with the W3C on our standards-based approaches and what we're actually incorporating from those from a security perspective. So we're incorporating the new levels of those. We're also taking RESTful approaches in how we're actually capturing the data. We're also looking in specifically now not only working in the medical device side, but also on the telco side, because these are going to be important partners now moving forward. So what kind of networks do you need to run on from a telecommunications perspective, because they are now going to be the, you know, from a mobile perspective in this case. And how do you integrate those networks into a back end of a healthcare system? So yes, we are doing that.
And just to be less glib, but very much in the style of everything's designed in RESTful style, but also just even in the way that people come along and define new types of payload IDs. These are all JSON defined, and then we use Concordia as a language to define the schema that refers to that payload ID. In the end, the semantics is defined by the code that consumes it. But it is a context in which we're using really modern, you know, web-based, semantic web-based approaches of defining the semantics. There's lots of new data types coming along here, so we can't sort of a priori specify. We have to be quite dynamic in allowing people to define new ones, but in a standardized model for referring to those, for referring to the schema that represents the semantics of that data payload.
I guess I should rephrase my question.
Yeah.
Is separating the data payload, which comes in all kinds of flavors and colors
Yep.
of syntax of
Yep.
JSON and XML and hashes and pipes and so on, whether you call it XML or
Yep.
HL7, your pipes or square brackets don't magically confer meaning to the payload, and to actually be taking seriously the need to have common dictionaries
Yep.
separately and independently. So, and that is only coming from sort of linked data principles, and
Yes.
that's really the question.
Right, so those get defined, and we take as much from the existing standard efforts to define the semantics of those payloads, and it is that level of indirection and referring then to the semantics behind what's referred to in that payload ID. Very much so.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead. Could you introduce yourself?
Hi, sorry, thank you. Esther Tchaikovsky, Fresenius Medical Care. I just wanted to mention that as a generalist who gets to jump out and look at standards periodically because I have a whole bunch of compliance responsibilities, the security pieces are in different places and very hard to find in the standards these days. Many of them are not in the particular standard itself. You have to look for clues, to look for clues, to look for clues. The variation between standards that contain the security and standards that don't is a bit challenging at the moment for a security person who focuses just on that to go find those pieces. That's one comment. The other one is about the banking industry. If it's any comfort, they didn't get it right the first time anyway. Payment card industry is actually going back. CI was their security piece, and they're going back and rethinking that and now saying the only thing to do is to encrypt it all the way from this point to this point as it goes through. So if we're behind them, then there are probably some mistakes we can make too, but it's still a good analogy to think about.
Okay.
I'll
Go
take
ahead,
the
Dennis.
first part of your question there. The problem with security is twofold. Number one is, much like our panel here, security is always put in at the end. Sorry, had to say it. And actually, truth of the fact is that one of the things that keeps us awake at night from a security aspect is we have to look at every standard that comes through the organization to decide where does it impact what we need to do. You have aspects of risk management, for example. HIPAA says, do an annual risk assessment, and then organizations apply for grants, and the first thing they find out is a third of the organizations don't have a formal process for even doing risk assessments. Let's see, when was HIPAA written? How long has it been around? And you can't show me the process you follow for doing risk assessments, but you're supposed to do them every year. So I guess the advantage we have, some of us in the room, is if you've worked in the federal sector with IT security in healthcare, I think we have a better understanding that you can't assume there's no security in a compliance requirement. So basically, when I hear any of the organizations that I work for say there's a new compliance standard coming out, I don't even worry about whether there's security in it or not. I read it because I know I'm going to find something that links. So, the only thing I can really say to you is everything probably has some impact on your security, whether or not it says security or not. So, sorry.
Looks like we have time for one more question. Thank you.
Samant, Cable Labs again. Since we're on the topic of security, I agree. A lot of times it's an afterthought. And one thing that concerns me is that, not with standards necessarily, but with implementations, there seems to be more of an emphasis, kind of parochial in a sense, on compliance rather than actually security analysis, so to speak. I've spoken to people where I say, what about privacy, non-repudiation, et cetera, and the response I get is compliance. It's compliant, so it's fine, right? Concerns me slightly. Having said that, I also want to clarify something that came up earlier. When we talk about the internet and the lack of security or banking or anything else, a lot of these broadband providers have worked out security at the transport layer. I can speak for cable, obviously. All cable modems have X5 inserts, and we can have mutually authenticated connections. I don't think a lot of architectures or implementations are looking at partnerships with broadband providers either. It might help simplify some things. If you go over the top, obviously you'll have to do it end-to-end, bottom to top. But if you do partner with broadband providers and others who can provide secure connectivity that may ease some of the higher level protocols and the message exchanges as well. A thought.
Well, just a quick comment. I guess the issue we have in the healthcare environment is, I can tell you, being as long as I've worked between VA and DoD interconnections, that the data goes between the two organizations is encrypted. All the requirements are being met. I think the issue becomes, and we'll start first in healthcare in general, you have the mom and pop shop doctor office communicating with the mom and pop shop pharmacy down the street. You know, we're not talking about the big guys, the Krogers, the Walmarts, the Walgreens, those types of things. We're talking about the local neighborhood pharmacy. So that's piece number one that I think is a big problem. And I agree with you, broadband, you know, every cable provider out there should be able to provide you something. The second piece is, you know, now we're talking about medical devices that may be mobile devices. You know, the best example I use in a lot of my talks is I have a glucometer at my house, and I have an infusion pump. And the minute I take my blood glucose, it tells my infusion pump what the setting should be. Whatever communications that's using, if you break that, could be risk to my life. So, you know, I think that the problem we have right now is the spectrum of where we are, where we're going. I totally agree with you. I don't think it's the, you know, I think it's scalability, but I think it's not a one solution is gonna hit it all.
Well, I fear that our time is coming to a near end. I had quite a few other questions, but I want to just leave you with a few takeaways. I think this has been fabulous. I want to thank the panel. We had hoped to go deeper on patient engagement, on the learning health system, on sense making, with different types of data and different streams of data, you know, environmental, others. So there's some things we didn't address yet in the panel. Hopefully they'll be addressed during the rest of the meeting. And enjoy visiting with a panelist if you'd like to have some more conversation. Thank you very much.